In the next section of Schelling's system of transcendental idealism, we move into the second epoch of consciousness. And all of this is going to be, and it gets more clear in this chapter, I think, basically a restatement of the old idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That is to say that the evolution of the consciousness of the individuals over time is a recapitulation of what the absolute is doing in the macrocosm as it evolves through a graduated series of stages in nature from the purely mechanical realm of matter to the organic realm and up through the organic realm from basic sensibility to irritability to formative reproduction. Nature is constantly moving through this process of evolution of consciousness, and so too the consciousness of the individual recapitulates this in a smaller microcosmic sense. And the second epoch that we saw last time, that the first epoch was moved into productive, what Schelling calls productive intuition from primitive sensation, and which had three substages. And in this epoch, which also has three substages, we're going to move into from the period of productive intuition into reflection. Now, by productive intuition, we saw last time this meant the creation of a stable world image by basic synthetic processes going on in the activity of what Schelling calls the productive self, or the productive activity of the intelligence of the self, which is the same thing as what Fichte was calling in the Wissenschaftslehre, the science of knowledge, the imagination. He was talking about how in that book the imagination is that which projects space-time and causality. Here, Schelling doesn't use that word and instead uses the word productive intuition, which is basically the same thing. And all of this is involuntary. It's a process that happens in a naive, natural, ordinary sense to every single type of human consciousness that comes into being. You know, it turns out that when we examine productive intuition a little more closely, we begin to see that there's a basic bifurcation in it. There is a productive intuition that has to do with the synthesis of the self and the outer object of the thing in itself, that is outer directed, and then there's an internal productive intuition that has to do with the form of the inner sense, and these will turn out to be the categories of space and time. He's now going to deduce them as productive forms of intuition, as acts of consciousness, basically, and he's going to take the Kantian categories, and in this chapter he turns them, for him they're not just concepts, they're acts. They're actual acts of productive intuition that take place, and there are three of them. The first, though, have to do with the space and time, productive intuition. Space is that aspect of productive intuition which is entirely outer. Pure extensity, divorced of intensity, is space, whereas pure intensity without extensity is time, and time is the form of the inner sense. And it's this sense that the self has of constantly reverting back into itself, which gives to it the sense of the present moment, and it has a kind of point-like unity about it. Whereas space, if left unchecked, would be infinite. There would just be infinite extensity if it were left unchecked by time. So space and time have to interact with each other in this productive synthesis in such a way that the point becomes the line, and the line is basically just an expanded point when it begins to interact with space. So space puts a restriction on time that causes the point of the present moment to become the line, and the line is basically an extended point, and that's what we saw last time. Was the first dimension of matter was the line length. So space is the form of the outer intuition, and it is pure extensivity. It is the stage upon which all of this happens, but it has to interact with time. Space, in its empty sense, is simply minus time, pure extensity, but when you add time to it, simultaneity, you begin to get the larger stage of coexistence and reciprocity. So he begins to move into this deduction of the Kantian categories of relation. The categories of relation were substance and accident, cause and effect, and the third category there of reciprocity. So substance and accident, then, that aspect of the object which is accidental is in time, and the temporal aspect of objects is that which flows and changes and goes through time. That's time, that's the inner sense projected into the object, the accidentality of things. That which perdures through the transformations of these accidents is substance. So that magnitude, that which in the object is the external magnitude is space, that in the object which is the internal or intensive magnitude is time. And so substance is basically space. It's linked with space, that which perdures the transformations of the accidents that flow over it, whereas those are linked with time. So this is the first intuition, basically, is the production of substance and accident. Then it moves into causality, that aspect in which both space and time and substance and accident are interrelated to each other, such that the transformations of the accidents as they move, let's say, from B to C, move in such a way that that which is accidental in B is the cause of that which is accidental in C. Not the substances, but the mere accidental transformations. And the fact that C follows from B in a necessary sense, and necessary always means that it could not have done otherwise, is the causal factor. And so causality comes in as the second intuition in this epoch, in which matter is subject to this necessary law that is the creation of the self in terms of its productive intuition as it generates the world of space-time and causality. But now, that aspect, if we think of C, the effect of the cause, having a ground within it that is also, in a reverse sense, the determination of B, so that C, something about C also may be possible, even though B precedes it in time. And this is, of course, what you get in things like final causality, where, from a certain sense, you could say that the tree is the cause of the acorn, so that a later effect can also simultaneously exert backwards in time, so that it also, the original acorn also acts as the effect of the cause. So the cause and effect are inverted. But this is reciprocity. So this is what Schelling deduces as the third intuition in this second epoch of reciprocity, in which C can also contain the ground, the accidental ground for the determination of B, the event that preceded it. So all of this is happening through productive intuition, which is constructing this stage upon which everything is happening. Now, reciprocity is also coexistence in space, and when we add time to that, time is simultaneity, we get coexistence and simultaneity in such a way that the universe is all held together as a single vast system of interpenetrating reciprocal causes and effects, and everything is held together in terms of a vast stage, or a vast proscenium. And that gives us essentially what he means by the second degree of productive activity, which is productive intuition in the second epoch, which produces these three sub-intuitions, so that the Kantian categories are not intellectual, because this is all happening, even animals do this, according to Schelling. This is all happening at the basic naive level of consciousness as it unfolds, in which intelligence, it is an active intelligence, but not reflective intelligence, because even animals do this, and intelligence is still identical with the body in the act of producing, in the act of productive activity, productive intuition. Intelligence has not been divorced from its basic identity with the body, such that with the animal we can say, and for this now, Schelling also flips over to the macrocosm, as he did last time, and he says that the macrocosmic, whereas last time he said that the macrocosmic counterpart of the first epoch of consciousness was the first and second potencies of matter, that is, say, matter in terms of the three basic forces of attraction and repulsion and gravity for the first potency, and then for the second potency, magnetism, electricity, and chemistry, corresponding to the original three acts of consciousness in the first epoch. In this second epoch, now we have the organic potency, the realm of living things. And he says the realm of living things corresponds to where we're at, especially the animal realm, specifically the animal realm, corresponds to where we are at this point in our deduction of consciousness. That is to say, sensibility. Sensibility was the first of the three in the earlier book that we had reviewed, where he talked about how in the organic world there are the 3 degrees of sensibility, which recapitulates magnetism, irritability, which recapitulates electricity on a higher turn of the spiral, and chemistry, which recapitulates, rather the formative urge, which recapitulates chemistry at a higher turn of the spiral. So we have those 3. But the animal world is sensibility, the production of, because the animal does the same thing, it too produces a world of space-time and causality. Its consciousness is an external correlate of what at this stage in the consciousness in which an ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, the individual human consciousness does. It hasn't yet arrived at the stage of reflection, that is to say, at this point. It's producing, and then producing an external world that is the correlate of the internal. And in organic nature has evolved itself. The absolute has evolved these stages of nature to get to the organic, which is the external correlate with the animal, in which sensibility predominates. As you move up the chain, sensibility predominates in the animal world in direct proportion to the degree to which irritability declines. Irritability is simply involuntary activity. And that corresponds to the fact that intelligence at this point in the development of the individual's consciousness has not yet become a reflecting intelligence. It is still such that my intellectual presentations are identical with the movements of my body, so that if I produce through my will, although will be developed in the third epoch, if I produce representations in my mind, I'm going to do something, and then I translate them into organic motion. The two are nearly identical at this point. Reflection has not yet come in, just as animals do not yet have reflection. And so the organic epoch in the outer world then corresponds to the second epoch, where we move from productive intuition to reflection. And then so as we move to the end of this, reflection, he says, will now begin to come in which all of this that has taken place in a naive sense, in which the self has not yet been able to intuit itself as producing. It's simply producing in a naive sense. It does not yet have full self-conscious awareness that it is in fact producing. That requires reflection. And so reflection then will be the capacity whereby the feedback loop between intelligence and the body, insofar as it's producing an external world for the consciousness, is interrupted by reflection now, which injects into this chain of involuntary necessary actions a purely free act. Reflection is purely free now. All of this previous activity of the self has been naive, unconscious, and involuntary, insofar as consciousness creates and generates a world for itself spread out in space-time and causality, same thing that it does for the animals. And so reflection will become something that injects into this feedback loop. It divorces the intelligence from its pure identity with the body, with the organism as the pure material substrate, and begins to introduce a cleavage, a separation, whereby the mind can now move into what will next be the third epoch, that will move from reflection to will, to the production of will. And so he also says that there have been now, looking back over this epoch, there have been both epochs, there have been three primary restrictions whereby evolution has restricted itself, both the evolution of the individual consciousness as well as the evolution of the spirit unfolding the world. The first restriction for individual consciousness was the self producing itself as its own object. That was the first restriction, whereby the self becomes its own object. The second restriction was whereby the thing in itself, the external thing that appeared to be separate from consciousness, appears and puts a limitation or a restriction on the self's activities. So the first restriction, the finite self, restricted the activity of the eliminable self. In the second case, the thing in itself puts a restriction as the not-self basically puts a restriction on the activity of the self, the empirical self, and that becomes the secondary restriction. Then there's a third restriction whereby the self must perceive itself as an organic individual amongst other organic individuals spread out at a particular point in space and time. Our consciousness, Schelling says, enters into time, the endless succession of the unfolding of presentations at a specific point, over which we have no control whatsoever. Later, of course, this will become for Heidegger the fact that we're thrown into a particular time and place. But in that second restriction, we're thrown into a particular point in evolution that we have no control over, and we simply take part in the flow of the consciousness of that epoch. And the third restriction is to recognize that we are limited insofar as we are organisms, restricted to a particular time in a particular place, and with certain organic potencies and capacities that are limited into this particular epoch. And so that is basically, in a nutshell, the synopsis of the second epoch of consciousness that has moved now in the individual from productive intuition that produced space-time, causality, matter, the whole material world, to now moving into the third epoch with reflection, where we'll see how reflection then produces the final aspect of will, and all of this will take place through the conscious reflective awareness of the philosopher, who through the ultimate act of freedom will now reconstruct the entire history of consciousness, as Schelling himself is doing in this text, through a complete act of freedom.